So yeah, I'll be here to talk about some work that Andrew Spall and I did looking at gastric cancer among level 2 Pacific ethnicities in New Zealand. So this was based on a broader project on reducing the burden of gastric cancer in New Zealand. Hence the focus in this case on stomach cancer, gastric cancer. But the idea is some of the methods that we went through to do this work could be applied to other health outcomes or even other ethnic groups and small populations within New Zealand. So there's a reference there to the full technical report that we've written up on the topic. It should hopefully be available shortly. We're going through the final formatting and so on of that. So that will be up on the iNZight website. And I've tried to structure this presentation to sort of cover some of the main points, but you'll see if you want to know more, you can have a look at the full report. So one of the main things we wanted to achieve with this project was just see what we could do in terms of looking at those smaller specific Pacific ethnic groups. The vast majority of research in various areas tends to focus on that overall level 1 Pacific ethnicity category, but that tends to hide a lot of the diversity within specific Pacific groups. So there are just a few categories there where you can see some variation between these groups. So things like the number of ethnicities each group identifies with, how long on average they've been living in New Zealand, those sorts of things. So we know there is a sort of a need and a desire to have more information on these more specific groups. So covered, for example, in the Ministry of Pacific Peoples Long-Term Investment Plan, this desire to get this sort of data where possible. Another focus of the project was looking at what additional information we can add when looking at gastric cancer outcomes that might help explain sort of variation between groups. So in terms of Pacific peoples, gastric cancer was the 6th most diagnosed cancer in recent years, and it would be good to know sort of why that is. And past research provides some sort of information about what those other interesting factors could be that we could look at to give us a bit more insight into what's going on here. So the Tokelau Island migrant study, for example, showed that migrants from Tokelau to New Zealand developed worse health outcomes over time. And thinking in terms of data available in the IDI that we could look at there, things like country of birth or time since arrival in the country could be quite useful to look at. But these aren't variables that are measured in the New Zealand Cancer Registry. So the New Zealand Cancer Registry simply provides general records of the occurrence of the cancer, clinical characteristics, that kind of thing. It's not designed to collect data on potential explanatory factors. Another thing of interest that's come up in a few papers that I haven't seen any research sort of specifically answering this just yet is this idea of whether survival estimates for gastric cancer cases among the Pacific population might actually be inflated due to people receiving treatment in New Zealand but then leaving the country back to the Pacific Islands post-diagnosis and therefore being lost to the administrative system in New Zealand. So we don't know whether they actually died or not and what sort of time frame. So using the IDI provides an opportunity to maybe have a look at some of these sorts of factors. So in terms of what we did for this research, our focal data set was the New Zealand Cancer Registry. We used all of the data available in the refresh that we were working with. So that's diagnoses from 95 through to 2021. And some of the things I'll talk about here are our work looking at updating ethnicity records by supplementing records in the Cancer Reg with records in the 2013-2018 census files and GIA birth records. We compared different available population denominators to have a look at how they compare in terms of looking at rates within the population. We looked at adding information about migration, so following diagnosis, do people stay in the country, do they leave? And then information about survival as well, so linking to people's death records. So that's just an overview of the general data sets that we use within the IDI, from the data provider to the specific data sets, and how we link those all together or join those with the New Zealand Cancer Registry. So to start with, ethnicity coding in the NZ Cancer Registry, we wanted to look at how much agreement there was with other sources for ethnicity, and then have a look at supplementing those records to create a combined record of ethnicity based on multiple sources. So previously, research from I think around maybe 2008 showed that ethnicity in recording in the New Zealand Cancer Registry tended to undercount a lot of ethnicities. But what we've seen here is that it's actually fairly consistent with the census and DIA birth records, just in terms of the amount of overcount or undercount relative to those records. The New Zealand Cancer Reg does have different processes now for recording ethnicity. So they actually use an algorithm to search through NHI records to continuously update ethnicity records in the Cancer Registry based on information that might be coming through through other records from other interactions with the health system. But we do see there is a bit of undercount going on, particularly for Kakalan Maori, Tongan, Niue, and Tukulauan ethnicities. We also see quite obviously very large overcount in terms of the Fijian Pacific ethnic group, as well as the other Pacific category. And that seems to be a common occurrence in administrative data sources. Apparently, Fiji and Indian ethnic records should be coded under Asian level 1 coding, but they tend to be split and maybe are being recorded in both Pacific as well. So what we did is took an ever recorded approach to combine these records. So if you ever had a given ethnic record in any of those sources, then we'd just combine that information and give you a yes or one for that ethnicity. And you can see here how that changes the counts in the original New Zealand Cancer Reg records versus our newly created variable combining those sources. So we see the biggest increase for Kakalan Maori ethnicity, Niuean and Tukulauan. Pretty significant decrease in the overall amount of missing data in the Cancer Reg, but interestingly, a lot of the increase in the Pacific ethnic counts from combining these records occurred recorded in the NZ Cancer Reg. So we also compared denominator sources in the IDI. Here I'll be comparing the 2018 census with the 2018 administrative population census. They have a pretty similar target population, except that the administrative population census includes people who are out of the country on census night. But otherwise, I've matched these two denominators so that they're both, the reference date is the 2018 census date. But an advantage of the APC is that it's available yearly, and you can specify it on any given date. So you don't have to rely on potentially out-of-date population count records for a given time period that you might be interested in. And so ideally, they should sort of match up in terms of the rates that they provide. So this is just general incidence between 1995 and 2021. That 2018 population, except there'll be differences due to either a different population count from either source or different linkage rates to the NZ Cancer Reg. But as you can see, it's reasonably consistent, a little bit of variation across different level 2 Pacific groups. And some of that will be due to random rounding as well, which I'll go over later on in the presentation. But we also see that if you look at more and more specific subpopulations, you might find more and more discrepancies between the performance of the 2018 census compared to the 2018 administrative population census. So you can see for a couple of age groups there, the difference in the incidence within the population tends to blow out a little bit. So we're using the IDI as well to explore that idea of do we lose some people to follow-up based on whether they might be leaving the country and not returning. Therefore, we don't have any knowledge of whether they have died, and so they might, for example, be considered as surviving, and that might push up survival rates and analyses. So for this, we looked at the Cancer Reg records linked to border movements data. And we were coding for whether people had left the country within a specified post-diagnosis follow-up period without a record of return or a death record in the administrative data in the IDI. Hopefully you can sort of read this. So those are the different sort of follow-up years that you might be interested in looking at. We can see that for the Pacific population overall, there was a higher percentage than the general population to have left the country without returning in any given follow-up period. And that rate did tend to increase for longer and longer follow-up periods. But overall, the percent of people leaving without return was pretty low. So you can use that to adjust survival estimates if you wish. If you're working in the IDI, you could exclude those people who were lost to follow-up from your analysis. Even if you didn't want to use the IDI for your work, but you wanted to use Cancer Reg data, you could use this sort of information to adjust your estimates. We also had a look at sort of mortality rates within the IDI. I've just put one example here of looking at 1 year mortality for different level 2 Pacific groups and demonstrating that issue of low counts when working with the small populations in the IDI as well. So here we've got mortality across 2 10-year periods for stomach cancer. So it does look like 1 year mortality rates tend to be decreasing for these level 2 Pacific ethnic groups. But if you have a look at the error bars on those estimates, those aren't your standard confidence intervals. Those are intervals of random rounding error for data that you get out of the IDI. So for data coming out of the IDI, it's subject to a random rounding requirement. That means data has to be rounded to the base 3, so it has to be a multiple of 3. Basically what that means is any given count that comes out of the IDI could have been generated from one of 5 underlying true counts. So once you account for that random rounding in the sort of the numerator value and the denominator value, that would be the maximum possible error you could expect in terms of what that true underlying proportion is. And so what you can see is that error margin really blows out a lot for small counts. So on the side of the screen there, you can see the actual counts that underlie these proportions. So for the Fijian group, for example, there were 9 diagnosed in the first 10-year period with 6 deaths. Those are quite small counts, and that's why the random rounding has such a big effect there. So the random rounding has a much greater effect on these smaller populations. You'll see there's total data suppression as well for the Tokelau group. That's because data or counts of less than 6 have to be totally suppressed. So that tends to be the more noticeable thing you sort of focus on when working on IDI data, not so much the random rounding error that can also occur for counts that are just above that threshold. So you can get around that to an extent, sort of using age standardized rates, but that still doesn't quite give you the actual underlying rate. So just to summarize, the IDI is a useful tool for providing this additional background information to sort of what's going on with certain health outcomes. We do see some problematic coding, however, of the Fijian ethnic category and administrative data. So that's something to sort of bear in mind if you're working with admin data records for that ethnicity. And low counts and confidentiality requirements can be a big barrier to producing useful data. So if it's possible to do stuff outside the IDI, you don't actually need that extra information. Obviously, it's a good idea to avoid using it if possible. But it does sort of create this interesting scenario where we've got these rules to, protect people's identities, but at the same time, it sort of creates this inequitable use of the IDI for different groups. You can look at things for big groups, but not small groups so much. But yeah, in terms of future research with this project, we do have a postgraduate student, civic postgraduate student, who will be looking at documenting this issue a little bit more in some resources for other IDI users and just workarounds in terms of data aggregation and that kind of thing, who Barry will be supervising for her honours thesis.
Would you be able to probably extrapolate at some stage, for instance, you're talking the Fijian data, but often you've got the crossovers and the mixed marriages, like you might have Indian and Fijian marry, or you might have a Tokelau and a Fijian marry, and then when you're trying to do this sort of data, one has like gastric incident, then how would you be able to break that down? Because you're talking about the small, it's hard in that smaller area.
Yeah. Do you sort of mean like in multiple ethnic identification type scenario, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In relation to a medical incident.
Right.
Like the gastric.
Yeah, good question. So in each of these sources, they do record up to 3 ethnic affiliations for most data sources in the IDI. So it is possible to sort of code different combinations of, say, Fijian and Tokelau, and quite difficult in this instance, again, for the certain health outcomes, because those counts do get even smaller. But it would be interesting to have a look at how that affects things. Yeah.
Do you expect the report will be published?
I would have hoped maybe. It's hard to say. It keeps sort of going out a bit, but hopefully maybe within the month. But if people are interested, I can send out an early version.
I think it's definitely be of interest to our Pacific team.
What was that, sorry?
I'll send you an email.
Oh, cool. Yeah, my email's at the start.
Cool.
I think it's just really important because, like you said, I looked at this for something else. I looked at how many IDI publications look at specific ethnicity, and it was a tiny 9 outputs out of like I can't remember what's the
1120.
Thank you. And part of the issue is because the numbers are so small, but making sure that you source your ethnicity data from as many places as you can rather than relying on one source, I think is the way to go, because we've talked about this with other people. People describe their ethnicity in different ways depending on which agency they're talking to, and ethnicity gets recorded in different ways. So yeah, I think it's just really important that that data is coming out. Society.
Yeah, and thank you for reviewing the work.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.